If you listen to Obama, his imagery is drenched in Christian rhetoric. One of his favorite phrases is, "We are our brother's keeper," lifted, by the way, right out of the Bible. Now, Obama uses this phrase. He's used it over 50 times with almost breathtaking hypocrisy. His own actual brother, George Obama, lives in a hut in Nairobi on a few dollars a month, unassisted by his multimillionaire sibling living at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
And then historically, we often hear atheists shedding crocodile tears over the crimes of Christianity. Oh, the Salem witch trials, 19 people were killed. Yes, that's 19 too many, I grant you. But while the atheists are weeping about people killed 200, 500, or in the case of the Crusades, 1,000 years ago, they often ignore the vastly greater crimes of atheism, which are much greater in magnitude and more recent in duration and are still going on. And people say, well, are we talking about like Mao in China or Stalin in Russia or the Nazi regime in Germany? And I go, that is just the tip of the iceberg. It is true that those three regimes, in a very short space of time, about 60 years, did manage to kill something on the order of 100 million people. But that doesn't even count a procession of Soviet dictators from Lenin through Andropov, Chernenko, Brezhnev. It doesn't count Kim Jong-il, Fidel Castro, Ceausescu, and Hoxha. It doesn't count Pol Pot. Pol Pot was the ruler of Cambodia in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. In 3 years, his Khmer Rouge wiped out 2 million people. 2 million! Even bin Laden, in his wildest dreams, does not even come close. So my conclusion is really nothing more than an objective one, namely atheism, not religion, is responsible for the mass murders of history. When we compare things and look at religion, we've got to look at the alternative, because we're going to be living this way or that way. We've got to balance out the ledger. And when we look at the ledger, on the balance of things, we have to say that if Christianity had not existed, this world would be a much darker place. And I think even those of us who are not believers can at the end of the day say, thank God for Christianity.
Consider Richard Dawkins. The God of the Old Testament, and I'm quoting him here by paraphrase, but it's pretty close to his actual words, is a megalomaniacal, genocidal, fratricidal, homicidal, homophobic, sexist, maniac. Think about that for a moment. First of all, this is very odd language coming from a biologist. Second of all, why would you be so angry about a God that you don't even think exists? Why would you be raving and ranting about if I read about Othello or Hamlet, I might write an analysis for a paper, but it doesn't get me all worked up, because I know that this character is fictional. The reason Richard Dawkins gets really worked up is this is the God that he rejects, the Christian God, the Jewish and Christian God. So even atheists are fighting a negative war against the only God that they consider has a real possibility of being true. That's why they have to work to bring him down, because he might win if they stop trying.
Where I'm going with all this is that people say capitalism is based on greed. But is the greed in capitalism? No. The greed is, in fact, in human nature. Greed is a bit like lust. It is built into the human frame. And so society has got to figure out what to do with these things. Historically, there have been some efforts to root them out. Those have proven somewhat impractical. And so what capitalism tries to do is to steer self-interest or greed in such a way that it serves the material welfare of society. To put it somewhat differently, capitalism civilizes greed in much the same way that marriage civilizes lust. Marriage tries to take lust and steer it to the mutual love, the raising of children,
and society is better off. And capitalism tries to take greed, a given, and channel it in such a way that it serves, if you will, the welfare of society. Now, we're living in a very unusual time in which atheism has emerged as a kind of militant phenomenon. And in the face of that, that's a little bit odd. Because if you are an unbeliever, why be militant? I don't believe in unicorns, but I haven't written any books on the subject. I don't spend a lot of time denouncing unicorns. I live my life as if unicorns did not exist. But what we have from the atheist side is a belligerent attack on theism and specifically on Christianity. Experience, by the way, cannot be written off so easily. Dan says there's no evidence for God. Well, here's one piece of evidence worth thinking about, and that is that 95% of all the people in the world, in one way or the other, experience God. Can you write off that experience? Are they all having hallucinations? Think about this. If we go to a village, and let's say we come from Mars, we know nothing about the village, and in this village, there are 100 people, and 95% of them know a guy named Bill. And you say, how do you know this guy Bill? They say, well, we have an experience of him. We communicate with him. We relate to him. We know Bill. But let's say that there are 5 guys who don't know Bill. In fact, 2 of them don't even think there is a Bill. They think that the other 95% made him up. So now I ask you, what's more believable? Is the atheist premise more believable, that actually there is no Bill and the 95% of people are flatly lying? Or is it more likely that there really is a Bill and 5 of the people just don't know the guy? What is more likely on the face of it? In other words, the fact of religious experience is worth taking seriously. One of the most astonishing things, look at this ridiculous rational society on the campus. What does that imply? The rest of us are irrational? Why? Simply because we don't agree with them on something like, is there life after death? The truth of it is, none of us has been to the other side of the curtain. We don't know for sure, but neither does Dan. The truth of it is, I have faith in life after death, and he has faith that there isn't life after death. But the poor man has deluded himself into thinking he's got a rational position. He's got some kind of evidence. What evidence? Has he interviewed dead guys? Has he been to the other side of the curtain? He has no evidence whatsoever, and so this rationality is a kind of a pose. Here's the point to remember at the end of the day. We are dealing with a deep fact of universal experience, something that has brought happiness and consolation to hundreds of millions of people. Consider death. We're all going to have to face it. Dan says, well, they tell religious people on their deathbed that they're going to believe in an afterlife. The truth of it is, religious people derive meaning, the sense of the sublime, a way to teach morality to their children. These are the practical benefits that religious belief delivers in the world. What does atheism deliver by comparison, except, if you will, a happy-face counsel of complete despair? One of the most interesting things about our debate today is the way in which issues that seem to have been debated, seem to have been settled in the 20th century, are back with us again. I should kind of confess I became interested in politics as a freshman at Dartmouth. This was in the early 80s. It was the era of Reagan. And if I think about Reagan, what Reaganism represented was a kind of challenge to the dominant idea of the 20th century. The dominant idea of the 20th century was, quite simply, collectivism. For Reagan, collectivism manifested itself in 2 forms: the Soviet Empire abroad and a kind of promiscuously expanding welfare state at home. About something that had begun with the New Deal, continued with the Great Society, and Reagan saw his career as mobilizing against this kind of expanding collectivism. When I came to America, I came to America as an exchange student in the late 70s. The public ethos in the United States had been set several years earlier by John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy said, if you are young, if you are idealistic, if you care, do what? Join the Peace Corps. Become a public servant. And the idea was that the public servant is a kind of embodiment of American idealism. Reagan challenged this. For Reagan, it wasn't the public servant. In fact, Reagan called him the bureaucrat. For Reagan, it was not the bureaucrat. It was really the entrepreneur who was the true American hero, the entrepreneur who takes a grain of sand and makes it into silicon. The entrepreneur is the embodiment, if you will, of American greatness. And Reagan had a rather dim view of the bureaucrats. In fact, even when Reagan was president, he showed an almost studied disinterest in large sections of the bureaucracy. At one point, he saw one of his own cabinet secretaries, Sam Pierce, and Reagan didn't recognize the guy. He was at a meeting of big city mayors, and he goes, "How are things in your city, Mr. Mayor?" And many people were outraged. They go, "How can the president not recognize his own cabinet secretary?" But I think from Reagan's point of view, this guy was the head of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I think for Reagan, that was a bit of a rat hole of public policy. Reagan felt, if I go in, I'll never come out. So Reagan focused just on a few large issues, but really he was against the idea of collectivism. And in some ways, Reaganism was successful. The Soviet Empire imploded, collapsed. The Berlin Wall came down. Even Bill Clinton ceremoniously announced the era of big government is over. In every empirical comparison between a capitalist and a socialist economy, the socialist economy proved to be a disaster. North Korea versus South Korea, for example. And all of this appeared to be a done deal. In fact, it appeared that capitalism was going to be not only victorious, but victorious in a more decisive way than had ever been the case before. Here's why. In the past, for example, around the time that Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, capitalism faced a formidable opponent, which was mercantilism, managed trade. And capitalism won that debate. But in the past, every time capitalism won a debate, some new opponent would come into the field and say, yes, but we are better. So capitalism would knock out one guy from the field, but another guy would show up to do battle all over again. At the end of the 20th century, we had a unique situation where capitalism had defeated its last opponent, leaving no challengers in the field. In fact, in the late 1990s, I would sometimes go to these rallies, demonstrations at trade meetings and so on, protests against globalization, in which you would have a lot of disheveled student types with slogans, "Down with capitalism." And somewhat affably, I'd walk up to these guys and tap them on the shoulder and say, "Hey, down with capitalism, right on, but up with what? What's your alternative?" And they would usually give you a suitably dazed expression. But what they were trying to say is, we're against capitalism, but no, we're not really for anything. We don't have an alternative ideology. We just think this is a bad thing. So the critics of capitalism didn't have a rival system or ideology to propose. Capitalism, in that sense, seems to have swept the field. But here we are, just a decade or so later, and it appears like we have that déjà vu feeling that these debates are all back with us in a really big way. And in some senses, it appears like we're having these debates all over again. I want to suggest, however, that this is not so. That we have actually seen a rather interesting and decisive shift in the nature of the debate. In a way, it's true, capitalism has won the economic debate. The old debates of the 20th century were debates about efficiency. The Marxists, if you read their works, were insistent that Marxism and socialism would be better ways of creating prosperity than capitalism.
That argument is actually over. You don't hear that anymore. But what we have now seen is a decisive shift in which capitalism, which was previously attacked on the grounds of efficiency, is now attacked on the grounds of morality. So we are now seeing a new moral debate about capitalism in which, from the left but also from the right, capitalism is indicted for producing efficiency, yes, but doing other horrible things to our values or our society or our community or our environment and so on. This is, in that sense, a bit of a new debate. It's new in its manifestation, although it's a debate that in some senses could easily be anticipated. It could be anticipated because the moral conundrum of capitalism is there from the very beginning. You see it right there in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is the classic defense of capitalism. But if you read it, you discover somewhat startlingly that it is a defense of capitalism, but it is not a defense of capitalists. In fact, if you look at the businessman, the merchant, the trader, Adam Smith takes a rather low view of that guy. For Adam Smith, the businessman, the merchant, is a bit of a low, selfish guy. He says, you can't leave businessmen alone in the room, because the moment you do, they start conspiring to fix prices. So in Adam Smith's view, you've got some rather dubious characters at the heart of the capitalist enterprise, but Adam Smith says not to worry, because through the invisible hand of competition, the individual selfishness or self-interest of these entrepreneurs will, in a sort of almost magical form, work itself to the general material betterment of society. So Adam Smith saying is competition will keep these dubious characters honest. Competition will work to the better of everyone. And this is a defense, as I say, of the system, capitalism, free markets, but not really a defense of the entrepreneur. I think that, I remember years ago I saw an interesting episode. It was a television show with John Stossel, who was then at ABC News, and he was interviewing Ted Turner. And Ted Turner, you might remember, had announced that he was donating $1 billion to the United Nations. And John Stossel said to him, he said, you probably fancy yourself to be a wonderful guy, but the truth of it is you're giving away all this money, and how do you know it's going to do a whole lot of good? How do you know you're not putting this money down a black hole? What if you were instead to use this money to invest in your businesses, create more jobs, maybe make CNN a little more competitive in the market? How do you know that you wouldn't do more good that way than by giving it away? And if you watch the interview, it was very interesting because Ted Turner became visibly incensed and actually got up and began to run off the set, followed by Stossel. And when Stossel finally caught up to him, he turned to Stossel and he said very petulantly, he said, I am just trying to give back to the community. And watching it, I'm thinking, well, how long have you been taking from the community? In other words, when you hear people say, I'm giving back, is almost a built-in assumption that what they do on an everyday basis is a form of legalized theft. They have in some senses committed the sin of making money, for which they now have to atone through the repentance of philanthropy or giving back. But if what you were doing was in the first place socially productive and good for society, you could still be philanthropic, but you wouldn't have this penitential tone, because you'd be doing more good on top of the good you're already doing by creating jobs and businesses and so on. So the point I want to make is that we are in a situation in which even the capitalists themselves have a kind of moral anxiety about the legitimacy, particularly the ethical legitimacy, of what they do. Now, is this notion, is this anxiety justified? The really odd thing is that one of the leading defenders of capitalism, Ayn Rand, author of Atlas Shrugged and a number of other books, takes the critiques of capitalism and refutes them by agreeing with them. And so, for example, one of the big critiques of capitalism is the businessman is a greedy, selfish bastard. What is Ayn Rand's response? True as charged. Rand wrote a book called The Virtue of Selfishness, in which she basically says, you accuse us of being selfish, and so we are. What of it? Selfishness is a virtue. And so what you have here is a peculiar dynamic in which the critics and the defenders of capitalism appear united in the affirmation that the system is based, you might say, ultimately on self-regarding drives, and not on community or the welfare of others. Certainly, by any conventional sense of morality, it seems a rather immoral, or at least dubious system. And yet, in a way, if you have any exposure to entrepreneurs, you notice something rather striking about them. And I think that in my experience, with the possible exception of the clergy, and that's only a possible exception, entrepreneurs, more than anyone else I can see, spend most of their time and effort anticipating and attempting to meet the wants and needs of other people. In other words, whatever the initial drive that tells someone to start a business, most of the entrepreneur's everyday hours are spent thinking about, how do I serve my customers better? Now, this may seem to be an exceptional quality, except you go to any other field and you see how extremely rare it is. Here we are in academia. I've been in academia most of my life. When I was at the American Enterprise Institute, I would stroll down the hallway. I saw one of my distinguished colleagues writing a book. I walk in. I said, "Oh, what are you writing about?" He says, "I'm writing an indispensable book on Gnosticism in the 4th century." I said, "Well, it's a rather striking topic. Has it occurred to you who wants to read a book about Gnosticism in the 4th century?" And he said, no. It actually hadn't occurred to him. This is a subject that interested him intellectually, and so he decided to write about it. And by the way, as an author, I'll tell you, most authors work that way. What am I interested in? The French Revolution. I'll write a book on it. I'll put it out there, and then I'm going to be mighty upset if there aren't very long lines outside Barnes & Noble and Borders of people lining up to buy my book. But if you ask me in advance, did I think about the potential audience for the book? No. This is what interested me. In other words, by and large, the intellectual is driven by his or her own interests, devoting very little attention to what potential customers there might be for this interest, who might want to read or learn about any of this. And if you want to know why classroom lectures are so terrible, I've given you part of the explanation. The intellectual is fascinated, in a sense, with himself. You simply happen to be in the room, collecting a grade at the end of it. But think about it, the entrepreneur could never work that way. The entrepreneur is selling soap or the iPad or a television program. The entrepreneur has got to not only satisfy, but really the best entrepreneurs have got to do something very remarkable indeed, to anticipate the wants and needs of people who don't even know that they have those wants and needs. The most successful products are not products that are on the market in which you're making a product better. That's ordinary entrepreneurship. The Japanese take a car and they go. Americans, when they drive to work, they like to have large portable cups of coffee, and they like to deposit the coffee just where their hand happens to fall. So there should be a coffee cup holder in precisely that spot. That's satisfying a human need at a very basic level. But here's something more dramatic. Take something like the iPhone, or even earlier, the Sony Walkman. Sony Walkman was invented by Akio Morita of Sony, Morita would go to the beach, and unruly teenagers would show up with loud boomboxes, driving him and his family nuts. And so Morita said, this is really annoying. Can't those people keep their music to themselves? So he rounded up some of his car engineers and he said to them, can't you find a way to take this music and attach it to some kind of node and stick it into people's ears so they're the only ones who hear this kind of nonsense? The rest of us won't be disturbed. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that not a single person wrote a letter to Morita saying, I want a Sony Walkman, I want an iPhone. No. The entrepreneur thought of it, anticipated it, built it, sold it, and then, if you will, the market came to buy it. The customer was the last man to show up, if you will. So, the point I want to make here is that even if the driving motive of the entrepreneur is self-interest, I want to make money, I want to support my family, I want to build a legacy, the operational activity of entrepreneurs, if they're going to be successful, is they've got to go a long way in thinking about what other people want and what's going to make other people happy.
I would argue that if you make a list of the beliefs of secular people, atheists, what are the things that they care about? The dignity of the individual, the importance of science as an autonomous discipline and a way to find the truth. The idea of compassion as a social value, the importance of human life, the importance of social justice. If you look at these very secular ideals, ideals that right now are at the centerpiece of our political debate, just listen to a relatively secular guy like Barack Obama. Here's Barack Obama, and now he's a Christian, I suppose, but he's not a traditional Christian. I would argue that Obama subscribes to a rather mutant strain of Christianity that I would call third world liberation theology. But nevertheless, if you listen to Obama, his imagery is drenched in Christian rhetoric. One of his favorite phrases is, "We are our brother's keeper," lifted, by the way, right out of the Bible. Now, Obama uses this phrase, he's used it over 50 times, with almost breathtaking hypocrisy. His own actual brother, George Obama, lives in a hut in Nairobi on a few dollars a month, unassisted by his multimillionaire sibling living at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. So Christianity here is being honored not in the practice, but nevertheless in the principle. And while Obama doesn't impose these principles on himself, some people say, I don't like to impose my Christian morality on others, but Obama doesn't like to impose it even on himself. Nevertheless, he is articulating a principle of social obligation that has its roots in Christianity. It certainly doesn't have its roots in science. Science by itself doesn't articulate any automatic social obligation. Certainly in doctrines like evolution, we can have a possible explanation for why people might be moral, but there certainly is no social justice gospel that comes out of it. Look at a principle as simple as the idea that human life is valuable. Human life is precious. Some people would say human life is sacred. Now, I would assume that secular people take this for granted, but historically, this principle was extremely controversial. It was certainly not affirmed in any general sense, even in Western civilization before Christianity. If you think of the ancient Greeks and Romans, they would have not only mass slavery, but the Spartans would take the unwanted kid, deposit it on the hillside, only to find it dead in the morning. And even the greatest thinkers of ancient Greece and Rome were well aware of this, but looked at it with virtual equanimity, with indifference. Why? Because the idea that every human life has value was at best a very qualified principle in that civilization. So today's idea that we should respect life, that life has dignity. By the way, the idea that human life has dignity is not simply a matter of abortion or euthanasia. It is at the very core of the UN Charter of Human Rights. The whole concept of universal rights comes out of the notion that human life has value and dignity. But why? Why should human life have dignity? Is there anything intrinsic about it that makes it different from the life of, let's say, a horse or a toad or a fruit fly? What confers dignity on human beings and not on those other creatures? Where do we get that peculiar idea? Then we go to another powerful idea in American politics, an idea without which our politics would be incomprehensible, and that is the idea of compassion. And compassion here, by the way, does not refer to the tribal principle that we should be helpful to people who are related to us. That's a universal principle. And in many cultures, anthropologists will tell us that people generally feel that you should help your family. And then beyond that, if you have some left over, you help your relatives, and then your neighbors, and then maybe your kinsmen or members of your tribe. But that's usually kind of it. And if somebody else shows up from another tribe or somebody who's a complete stranger and they have a problem, well, you might want to help if you feel like it, but you really don't need to. It's not your problem. Because ultimately, they're nothing to you. They're not a member of your group. However, in Western civilization, almost uniquely, we have this idea of universal brotherhood and compassion for the stranger who is truly nothing to us. Tomorrow there was a big famine in Haiti or in Ethiopia. You could almost predict in advance the global reaction. In China, a massive yawn of indifference. In India, inaction. In the Muslim world, there's a lot of oil money over there, but there would be no automatic obligation to help. Meanwhile, there would be a big convulsion throughout the West, the European countries and America, churches getting active, food being sent all over the place, Doctors Without Borders, St. Jude's Hospital, and all of this, I'm saying, the secular part and the Christian part. Why are they coming only from Western civilization? Why here? Are Western people inherently more large-hearted than people elsewhere in the world? Nonsense. My point is that Western people, whether they are nominally secular or actively Christian, have been shaped by the same culture of universal brotherhood and obligation to the stranger, and that principle was injected into the West by Christianity. Some of these Christian ideas, I admit, were derived from Judaism, but Judaism, in a way, implemented them in a sort of tribal way, that these are God's truths for our people. And what Christianity did was take those principles and universalize them, giving them a much wider and a much broader application. And now I want to fast forward a little bit and talk about the American founding. And this question sometimes disputed about whether America is a Christian nation. Well, I guess you have to think about what do you mean when you say something like that. Very often those debates degenerate into arguments about did Ben Franklin go to church and was Thomas Jefferson really devout and what were Washington's true religious commitments. And we can have that discussion. But to me, the question of whether America is a Christian nation is a way of asking, are the core principles of America, and by this I mean its economic principles, its underlying philosophical foundation, the way America conducts its foreign policies, the way America's government is structured, what are the underlying assumptions, and where do those assumptions come from? Think of some features of our government: separation of powers, checks and balances. Why do we have those? What is the need to separate powers? What's the point of it? Other cultures don't have that. You have democratic societies that don't have separation of powers or checks and balances. Why do we have those? Because underlying those is a certain assumption about human nature. And what is that assumption? It was given very clearly in a way by Immanuel Kant 2 centuries ago. Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. Which is to say that human nature is a little bent. It's a little warped. And if you give power to human beings in that way, they are going to misuse it, most likely. And therefore, power has to be given, but therefore, let's distribute it. And even distributing it isn't enough, because you can have bargains among corrupt people who say, I'll scratch your back and you scratch mine. So quite apart from separating power, you need third parties looking over what people are doing and blocking them. So if you look at American politics, there's an inbuilt inertia. Sometimes it seems like nothing ever gets done, but that is by design. Nothing ever gets done because we want to stop human nature from having its full corrupt flower. This idea, again, very antithetical to the premise of modern liberalism. The premise of modern liberalism is that liberty is wonderful, and when you let people be free, they will use freedom well. This, by the way, is a principle held in defiance of all known facts. You simply have to look around you to see that many times, maybe most often, liberty is not used well. My friend Michael Shermer is a libertarian. I would argue that the best way to be a libertarian is to reject the liberal assumption that often undergirds libertarianism and to replace it with the Christian assumption that the case for liberty depends on showing how corrupt people and a warped human nature should nevertheless be given the exercise of liberty. How does that work? Why is that a good idea? So I've mentioned separation of powers and checks and balances. Let's look for something that was truly bad about America, in fact, America's original sin, many would say, and that's slavery. Now, American slavery was anomalous in some ways in that it was racial slavery, different from, say, Greek and Roman slavery, which was not based on race. But nevertheless, American slavery was common in the sense that it was based upon a universal practice. Slavery existed everywhere in the world from the beginning, the dawn of mankind. Now again, very interestingly, this universal practice of slavery was abolished in only one culture, Western culture. There is no example of an anti-slavery movement outside the West, anywhere in the world, at any time. So again, we have an interesting question. Are people in the West morally more elevated than everybody else? They simply think more deeply? No. They have ideals. They have a set of ideals that caused people in the West to look at slavery, which was, by the way, like the family, an institution taken for granted. For many centuries, slavery needed no defenders because it had no critics. But suddenly people began to look at slavery differently. Now, Michael Shermer is likely to say, well, that's because in the modern era, the Enlightenment came along and people began. No. The anti-slavery movement in Western civilization began in the 4th century. That was around the time that Constantine converted to Christianity. And by the 10th century, there were virtually no slaves left in Europe. Slavery was abolished in Europe between the 4th century and the 10th century, long before the Reformation and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and all of it. Now, there was a second anti-slavery wave in America that came later, and that too was led by the Quakers and the evangelical Christians and a whole bunch of guys who said, wait a minute, if we are created equal in the eyes of God, then no man has the right to rule another man without his consent. And if you think about it, this idea, a theological idea, by the way, is now given a novel political implication. For some centuries, some Christians thought that that idea applied only to the next world. But the Quakers and the evangelicals said, no, if we are equal in the eyes of God, we are equal in the eyes of God now. And that means that there shall be no rule without consent. And by the way, if you think about it, this is not only the anchoring principle of anti-slavery, of abolition, but it's also the anchoring principle of democracy. Why? Because democracy, modern American democracy, the democracy we're going to be exercising in 1 month, almost to the day, democracy is based on the same idea. No man, no person has the right to rule another without consent. So here we go. Here is a principle of democracy which is secular, which in no way requires you, when you go to vote, you're not required to subscribe to the 10 Commandments or carry a copy of the Bible, and yet, if it wasn't for the Bible, you wouldn't believe that. You wouldn't be doing that. So in some senses, when we talk about is America a Christian nation, the right way to answer that question is it not a fact, an historical fact, that Christianity has embedded into this culture, even into atheists, a way of thinking, so that even atheist hostility comes out of Christianity. Think about it. Atheists disbelieve in the Christian God. They pretend to disbelieve in other gods, but they don't really care. They don't really consider it even possible that these other gods could be true. On the other hand, they rage against the Christian God because they're afraid of him. I've spoken a little generally about the entrepreneur. These debates as we're having them today, however, are not conducted in these abstract forms. They're conducted in very concrete debates about financial regulation and health care and so on. I must say that these debates, if you watch them carefully, are actually debates of low comedy. I was watching the healthcare summit, which some of you might have seen with Obama in the starring role. And actually the Republicans, by the way, were part of the comedy because, for example, both sides agreed emphatically that insurance companies were being just downright terrible in not providing insurance to people who have pre-existing conditions. And this was an article of, as I say, bipartisan agreement. This issue of bipartisanship, I mean, you shouldn't get me started on this, because one of the challenges I have as living in America is explaining to my family in India what's going on in American politics. It's really very hard to do. My parents said, "Can you explain American politics?" I can't do it. So finally I said to my mom, I said, "Mom, let me give you a summary. We have two parties in America. We have a stupid party, and we have an evil party." I said, I happen to be a proud member of the stupid party. I said, once in a while in this country we do things that are both stupid and evil, and those things we call bipartisanship. But that aside, back to the issue of pre-existing conditions. Imagine the following conversation between me and my insurance company. "Hello, insurance company, it's Dinesh. Dinesh, great to hear from you. What can we do for you?" "Well, you know, I actually would like to purchase some fire insurance for my house." "Wonderful. We've got some great policies for you. How's your house doing?" "Well, not so good. It's actually on fire." "It's on fire?" "Yeah, it's on fire right now. Things almost burned to the ground." "Well, shouldn't you be calling the fire department?" "Well, it's too late for that. The house is pretty much a goner. What I really need is a lot of cash to pay for me to replace it and have a new house." Well, the insurance company is going to say, "Well, you dummy, that's not what insurance is. Insurance is a bunch of guys whose houses are not currently on fire, putting money into a pot, so if somebody's house happens to burn in the future, we'll have some money to be able to replace it." So this gives you a little bit of an idea of the idiocy that now passes for public debate in our society, unchallenged in the arena of intelligent discussion. Now, to me, these are really not debates about abstractions, because at the root of it, what they're getting at is what kind of society we're trying to be in America. Now, when we think about America, we often think about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and various structures of government and so on. And those are important. They're important because if you look at what distinguishes America from the rest of the world, it is that America was set up as an entrepreneurial society. If you read the Constitution before the Bill of Rights was added, ignore the Bill of Rights, look only at the original Constitution, how many rights are mentioned in the original Constitution? And the answer is none, or actually only one. And that is the right to have
patents and copyrights. So for the founders, the idea of property rights and to being able to own property and trade, this was fundamental. This was part of the original structure. The other Bill of Rights were appended later, and there was some debate over whether they were needed at all. So America's an entrepreneurial society, very different than Europe, by the way, and very different than most of the world. In fact, historically, the entrepreneur has been looked down upon, has been reviled, has been scorned as a kind of very low, dubious character. Confucius says that the wise man knows how to be honorable. The low man engages in trade. In India, in the Indian caste system, the merchant is pretty close to the bottom. You have the Brahmin or the priest at the top, the warriors and kings and the aristocrats come next, and you go on down the line, and one step above the hated untouchable is the entrepreneur. And so it has been in many cultures. In fact, in Islam, I was reading a wonderful essay by the medieval Islamic historian Ibn Khaldun, and he's discussing the question of which is more wonderful, which is more praiseworthy, to become wealthy through trade or to become wealthy through looting. And he says, quite obviously, it is much better, morally, to become wealthy through looting. Why? Because he says looting is very manly. If you're going to loot someone's stuff, you've got to show up at their village, you've got to beat up their men, you've got to engage in man-to-man combat, and then, if you will, you've got to take their stuff. Trade, he says, appeals to what is sort of effeminate and base in human nature. Now, I only say all this to show you that what the American founders were doing is producing a radical moral inversion. They were taking the entrepreneur from the bottom of the heap and putting him on the top. They were trying to create a different kind of society based on mobility, based on opportunity, and this is the America that I wanted to come to growing up as I did in India. Now, even today, a lot of people will say, well, yes, but you know, the European societies are better. They offer a much more expansive safety net if you need to have your hip replaced, if you are worried about your retirement, if you get sick. You'll be better provided for in Holland or in Germany or in England. And it's true. European societies do offer more security. But America offers more opportunity and more mobility. If you're a guy starting out at the bottom, you have a better chance of making it to the middle or the top in America than you do in just about any European country. Even now, if you meet a rich guy in Germany or France, it's a 50-50 bet that he or she comes from a rich family. In other words, success stories do exist, but they're episodic. People comment on them because they're unusual. In America, success stories are so numerous that we've really stopped counting. In fact, it's very normal in an American family to have one guy who is vice president of Oracle Software, and his brother is pumping gas at the local gas station. That's not unusual. Same family, same gene pool, same social conditions, but radically different outcomes. Not long ago, when we think of America, we often think of economic opportunity. And in fact, we think immigrants come to America for economic opportunity. And that's true, but it's not the whole truth. In fact, I grew up in a middle-class family. My dad was dead now, but he was an engineer. My mom, a school teacher. And I grew up without great luxuries, but not lacking for anything. So if you were to ask me, Dinesh, materially, has your life been better in America? I would say, yeah, it has. But it is not a radical difference. Actually, my life has changed more in other ways. I asked myself, what would my life have been like if I never came to America, if I stayed in India, for example? Well, if I stayed in India, the chances are I would have lived my whole life in a 10-mile radius of where I was born. I would have without a doubt, have married a girl of my identical caste and socioeconomic and cultural background. I would almost unquestionably have become an engineer like my dad, or a doctor like my grandfather, or some kind of a computer programmer. I would have a whole set of views and opinions that could be predicted in advance. So what am I saying? Well, what I'm saying is that my destiny would to a large degree have been given to me. Not that I would have no choice, but the choice is within confined parameters. Now I come to America and I discover something quite startling. I discover suddenly that to a degree that is not possible in any other country, and to a degree I would have thought impossible, I find in America I am the architect of my own destiny. In other words, in America, my life is more like a blank canvas, and I am the artist. In America, your destiny isn't given to you, it's constructed by you. So your major decisions in life, where to live, who to love, who to marry, what to become, what to believe, these are decisions made by you, the individual, for yourself. So this, to me, is the core idea of America. It's the idea, you may say, of the self-directed life. And if we see a problem with the idea of this massive and encroaching government, it is ultimately that what it is encroaching on is precisely that freedom to make your own way, to shape your own destiny. It is ultimately substituting the directed, the choreographed, the planned, the overseen life from the self-determined life. Now, again, this action is defended on the grounds of virtue. It's making people more compassionate. It's making people do right. If you listen to Obama's rhetoric, that's the underlying idea. We want to call people to something higher. But I want to suggest to you that this something higher, far from being an affirmation of virtue, is actually a complete evisceration of it for the following reason. Imagine if I'm walking on the riverbank, and a guy comes up to me and he goes, "Hey, I see you're eating a sandwich, and let's make it a really good sandwich. It's a Subway foot-long sandwich that I bought for $5, having watched one of the recent commercials on this subject. And here I am with this massive, gigantic Subway sandwich. And a guy comes and says, 'I'm hungry. Can you give me half your sandwich?' And so I do. Well, this is a very nice transaction. Why? First of all, I've done something good that deserves some moral credit. The person receiving has a sense of obligation. Wow, that was really nice of you, Dinesh. And I could really use the sandwich, and maybe someday if I'm in a better position to help some other guy, I'll do that. So it's a transaction that seems to be good all the way around. Good for me, good for the beneficiary, good for society. Now let us modify this example slightly. Here I am walking on the riverbank with this very same Subway sandwich, and a guy comes up and says, "I'm hungry, Dinesh, give me your sandwich." This time, however, I say no, or I say nothing. And who should show up at this moment on a white horse but President Obama, who dismounts his horse, comes running up to me, puts a gun to my head, and says, "Hand over your sandwich." And so I do. And Obama splits the sandwich in half, returns one half to me, and gives the other half to the hungry guy. Now, if you look at it from the point of view of the outcome, it's exactly the same. The hungry guy ends up with half my sandwich. But now you ask, have I done a good deed? No, because I was forced. I gave under duress. I deserve no moral credit at all. I had no choice in the matter. Is the beneficiary filled with a sense of wonderful obligation and good feelings? No, because to him it's an entitlement. To him, that's a small down payment on all the sandwiches that he's due from society all the way down the road. Society actually owes him more. So what I'm getting at is here you have a transaction, the outcome the same, but all the moral qualities stripped from it. So you might say that the outcome is better or worse, but you really can't say it is appealing to the better angels of our nature. It is really a transaction produced, you may say, under gunpoint, without a choice in the matter. And such is the nature of government action in a society. It is the essence of a government transaction to be coercive. It was rather interesting recently to watch the hearings in which people from financial firms were trotted out before the congressman, who made such memorable statements as, "You people don't know how to handle other people's money." Did you actually hear this? And of course, the key difference is that in the case of the financial firms, it's shrewd investors who have put their money, and if they lost their money, it's partly their own stupidity, and they could always have put the money somewhere else. But this is not the case with the government, in even the simplest transaction. Let's say, for example, one of the first things I learned in America when I came here is that the government has a very wonderful idea for me to save for my retirement. It's called Social Security. The government says, "We've thought of this, it's fabulous, it's going to make you better off." Now imagine the following transaction. I say to the government, "This is really very thoughtful of you. I really appreciate your thinking so far ahead for my security. But I'm an emancipated American. I appreciate the offer. Thanks, but no thanks. I'll be saving for my own retirement. You don't need to do it for me. I don't want to make any contributions. In fact, I'm not going to. And when I get old, I will rely on private charity, or I will appeal to family, and if they won't help me, I will die in the street." What would the government's reaction to this be? The government's reaction to this would be, "Dinesh, either you turn over your money, or we will kill you." And if this seems like a bit of an overreaction, it's really not. Because the government's point is, we're going to come and charge it to you anyway. So let's say I don't pay. Agents will show up at my house and surround it. They'll say, "We're going to take your house." And clumsy defender of my property though I am, I may reach for, an old Civil War pistol and show up at my window to defend myself, at which point I will be shot. In other words, the point I'm trying to make is that when it comes to the government, coercion is the order of the day. But let's step back for a moment. This all may seem a little radical to you, because all of this is being done in the name of one key principle, and that principle is the principle of equality. In other words, the idea is that capitalism creates wealth, but it doesn't create a good distribution of wealth. It creates inequality. If I can think of one predominant idea driving Obama, it's that here we have a pie, and I, Obama, have got a lot of wonderful ideas about how to carve the pie. I don't think it's ever occurred to Obama, how do you make a pie? How do you make a pie grow? Those things haven't really crossed his mind. But he's got great ideas on distribution. But the question we have to ask is, and the basic assumption behind that is that capitalism produces efficiency, but it also produces injustice. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Capitalism is profitable for the few, leaves everybody else in the lurch. And it's worth asking, is that really true? I've looked rather carefully at not only data, but standards of living, easily verifiable in everyday experience, in America in the past 3, 5, 10, 20, and 50 years, to see if it is a fact that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And I think beyond dispute, it is not a fact. The rich have gotten richer, and the poor have also gotten richer, but not at the same pace. In other words, inequality is greater. But inequality is greater as a result of what? People say, well, we've seen a disappearance of the middle class. We have seen an erosion of the middle class, but why? We've seen an erosion of the middle class because the middle class has forked into two. It has become, if you will, a middle class, and now an upper middle class, what I sometimes call the first mass affluent class in world history. It's worth stepping back to see what we're getting at here. Historically, the great achievement of the West was to take people who are poor and make them middle class. You look at the difference between, say, America and India. Historically, India looks like a pyramid. Few rich people at the top, a thin sliver of people who are in the middle, and then the vast majority of people poor here at the bottom. The great achievement of the West was to take this pyramid and make it a diamond. A small number of rich people, a large number in the middle, and then a small number of poor at the bottom. Now, America is moving toward, you may call it, a situation in which the people from the middle are moving up. The number of millionaires in America today, people whose net worth in real terms exceeds $1 million. 5 million families. In other words, what's happened to the middle class is a lot of people have moved out because they have moved up. They haven't become poorer. They have actually become better off. If I were to make a list of the values that the atheists cherish the most, I would list values like the idea of individual dissent, the notion of personal dignity, the idea of equality, the equal dignity of men and women, an antipathy to oppression, inequality, and slavery, the idea of compassion as a social virtue. Now, what's interesting is that if you take a good look at this list, you realize that these values came into the world because of Christianity. How do we know that? Partly by looking outside of Western civilization, where we see that these things that we take for granted, there's a tsunami that devastates a place in Africa, all the Western, which is to say Christian nations, rush to help. Nobody else seems to. Something unique is going on that's internal to our civilization. Now you might say, well, Western civilization isn't just built on Christianity, it's built on Athens, by which we can say classical reason, and also on Jerusalem, which is Judaism and Christianity. And yet if you look at the world of Athens, which is to say Greece and then pre-Christian Rome, you discover that those were civilizations that were based on slavery. They were civilizations where women were treated very badly. They were civilizations where human life didn't count for a whole lot. The Spartans notoriously would leave the feeble child on the hillside to see if it was still alive in the morning. And the great philosophers of Greece and Rome viewed these incidents with equanimity. They didn't think it was a big deal. It is only from Christianity that these things that had been uncontroversial for a long time become controversial for the first time. In Sam Harris's book, he tries to blame slavery on Christianity. But the reality is that if you look at history, slavery was a universal institution, practiced in every known culture. The Greeks and Romans had it. The Chinese had it. There was slavery in ancient India. American Indians had slavery long before Columbus got here. So it is Christianity that mobilized the first movement in the world to oppose slavery. First the Quakers and then the evangelical Christians took a theological idea that we are all equal in the eyes of God. An idea that, by the way, for some centuries was seen as a merely spiritual truth, and they gave it a political application. If we are all created equal in the eyes of God, no man has the right to rule another man without his consent. This idea became the moral engine of the anti-slavery movement both in Europe and in America. And this concept is not only the moral root of anti-slavery, it is also the basis of democracy. What's the premise of representative democracy? No man has the right to rule another without consent. And I want to turn for a moment to science, because one of the rallying cries of modern atheism is the supposed incompatibility between Christianity and science, an incompatibility rendered puzzling at the outset because if you make a list of the leading scientists of the West in the past 500 years, you find that the vast majority of them were not only theist, but specifically and devoutly Christian. This was true of Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, Bry,
Priestley, Lavoisier. You can just go down the list all the way through Gassendi, Mersenne, Mendel. Some of these guys were monks. Like Mendel, Gassendi, and Mersenne were priests. So right away you have a puzzle. We have literary theorist Christopher Hitchens and biology major Sam Harris positing a supposed conflict that was not evident to the great scientists of the West, stretching from Kepler to Newton. I want to make perhaps a further point about this, though. Not only were these scientists Christian, not only did they see their work as revealing the divine handiwork in the universe, but I want to argue that modern science itself is based on three Christian assumptions that are at root metaphysical. Assumption number one, the universe as a whole is rational. The universe embodies rationality. Now, if you think about it, that's odd. It's pretty easy to say that my friend Bill is rational, or Christopher Hitchens is partially rational. It's another thing to say that matter and objects and planets embody a certain kind of rationality. They follow rational principles. Number two, the universe obeys laws that are comprehensible in the language of mathematics. Again, if you think about it, that's very strange. If I'm driving my car, I can follow laws. I see a stop sign, I come to a halt. How does matter obey laws? How does the electron know what to do? If we look at matter, it is unbelievably well behaved. It follows the laws of Newton's inverse square law. It obeys Einstein's laws. The point I'm trying to get at here is that this is a metaphysical proposition. A third one. The laws out there in nature are mirrored by the goings-on within our minds. We can apprehend and understand the laws. Very odd. Why should the goings-on within our head match the goings-on in the universe? Now, if you're a believer, you know why. God is believed to be omniscient, which is to say super-rational. He built the universe to embody rationality. God is a lawgiver, and the universe reflects His laws. We are made in God's image. We have a spark of the divine, so it's not surprising to the theist that you have this arrangement. But for the atheist, you can't take any of that for granted. This is faith-based science. A final point. We hear a great deal about how Christianity has been terrible for the world. The truth of it is, if you look at the casualties of Christianity, the Inquisition, the Crusades, the Salem witch trials. I read a book on the Salem witch trials. I had been educated to believe the Salem witch trials had killed thousands, or at the very least hundreds of people. I discovered that at the Salem witch trials, the number of people executed was in fact 18. The Inquisition, if you read Henry Kamin's book, the most authoritative study of the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, over 300 years, killed 2,000 people. Now just try to compare that to the crimes inflicted by atheist regimes, not 500, not 1,000 years ago, but within our lifetime. If you look only at the big three, Stalin's Russia, Mao's China, the Nazi regime in Germany, you have within the space of 5 decades over 100 million casualties. So atheism, not religion, is responsible for the mass murders of history. I want to end by saying that I think Christianity has done a lot for the world. The world would be a lot worse if we didn't have it. I think even Christopher Hitchens, by the end of today, should be chanting, if only under his breath, "Thank God for Christianity."